Darkness has a weight you only understand when you're completely alone in it. I was returning from a hiking trip in the Cascade Mountains, a route I'd done countless times before. However, on that particular night, the weather forecast was grotesquely wrong. What should have been just a light rain quickly turned into a severe storm. The water lashed against my windshield with extreme violence, and the wipers could barely keep up. The dashboard thermometer read around 38 degrees Fahrenheit, but the wind seeping through the cracks made it feel much colder. I was driving along a secondary route, a shortcut surrounded by dense pine forests, trying to cut through to reach the main highway. Visibility was practically zero, maybe no more than 15 feet ahead of the hood. With each turn, the tension increased until the inevitable happened. A landslide mixed with heavy branches blocked the road. There was no way to pass. I tried to put it in reverse, but the rear tires sank into the thick mud on the shoulder. The engine roared in protest, but the car didn't move an inch. I was stuck. I grabbed my cell phone, only to confirm what I already feared: zero signal. The rain began to turn into hail, threatening to shatter the car windows. Staying inside wasn't a safe option. I remembered passing an old farm a few miles back. With no alternatives, I grabbed my flashlight, put on my waterproof jacket, and decided to walk back in the darkness. The wind almost knocked me over as soon as I opened the door, and the biting cold immediately penetrated my bones. Walking along the edge of that road was one of the hardest things I've ever done. With every step, the mud pulled at my boots, and gusts of wind threw icy water directly in my face. After what seemed like hours, though I should have only walked half a mile, the outline of a massive structure appeared against the night sky, briefly illuminated by lightning. It was an old barn of gigantic proportions, with the roof partially collapsed on one side, but still offering far better shelter than the open road. I waded through the tall, soggy grass to reach the large, double wooden doors. They were swollen with moisture and stuck, requiring me to put all my weight against the rotting wood to force them open. The interior was vast and shrouded in absolute darkness. The smell of old hay, accumulated dust, and abandoned machine oil filled my lungs. I closed the heavy door behind me, blocking the raging wind, and the immediate relief was indescribable. The temperature inside must have been around 45 degrees Fahrenheit, which was already an improvement over the freezing outside. I used my flashlight to survey the place. There were remnants of rusty farm equipment, moldy hay bales, and various tools hanging on the walls. I found a relatively dry corner on the lower floor, away from the gutters of the damaged roof, and sat on a less damp pile of hay. I tried to convince myself that I was safe, that I just needed to wait for dawn to seek help, but there was an unnatural stillness within that immense space, a heavy feeling that began to make my stomach churn. As time passed, the cold began to seep in again, but what truly bothered me was the atmosphere of the place. The barn creaked intensely in the force of the outside wind, sounding like an old ship about to sink. The storm outside continued relentlessly, but my mind began to focus on the details inside. There was a tall window on the opposite wall, its glass cracked and covered in dirt. Lightning illuminated the space intermittently, creating grotesque shadows that seemed to dance among the abandoned tractors. I tried to keep the flashlight off to conserve battery, turning it on only for short periods. It was in those dark moments that paranoia began to set in. I started to feel that I wasn't alone. You know that visceral sensation of having someone's eyes piercing the back of your neck? That's exactly what I experienced. The space was too large, full of dark corners and thick support beams. My instinct told me to get up and leave, to face the storm outside, but logic held me there. Staying in the storm would be suicide. I tried to control my breathing, telling myself it was just the isolation and exhaustion playing tricks on my mind. The exhaustion from the walk tried to pull me towards sleep, but my body refused to relax. With each clap of thunder, my muscles contracted. The night seemed to drag on, and I had no idea what time it was. but I felt that the worst was yet to come. The change in the atmosphere wasn't subtle, it happened suddenly, as if the oxygen had been sucked from the air. The first thing I noticed was the smell. It was no longer the odor of mold and dust. It was a putrid, overwhelming smell, a mixture of rotten meat with wet fur and something metallic, like old blood. The stench invaded my nostrils, making me gag. I covered my face with the collar of my jacket, trying to filter the air while my eyes scanned the darkness. The wind outside seemed to have subsided for a moment, creating a tense silence. And then I saw. Through the cracked window on the right side of the barn, illuminated by a distant flash of lightning, a silhouette loomed against the dirty glass. It was immense. The base of the window was about 7 feet from the ground on the outside, and the shadow completely covered the opening. My mind froze. No wild animal native to that region was that tall. For a second I absurdly considered it might be a person, but the width of the shoulders and the massive, irregular shape of the body immediately ruled out that idea. The shadow moved slowly, blocking the little light that entered. The smell became unbearably strong. Absolute terror gripped me. My hands began to tremble uncontrollably, and I cowered even further into my corner, silently praying that it was just a hallucination caused by fear and extreme cold. Time stood still. The shadow outside the tall window vanished, but relief didn't come. Instead, I heard the sound of something heavy moving in the mud around the barn's foundation. It was footsteps, but not the hooves of an ordinary quadruped. It was a heavy, dragging bipedal gait. Each step made the ground tremble slightly. The sound wound its way around the structure until it stopped right at the wall opposite my hiding place, where there was a wide gap between the rotting wooden planks. I held my breath, feeling my heart pounding so hard it hurt in my chest. The storm raged again, and a lightning bolt ripped across the sky, illuminating the crack. It was only a second of clarity, but it will be etched in my mind until the day I die. Through the opening in the wood, I saw his face. It wasn't a wolf, and it definitely wasn't human. He had a long, dark snout full of scars and pointed ears, but his facial structure was strangely intelligent, wicked. His eyes were large, a bright yellow that seemed to emit their own light, and they were fixed directly on me. He knew I was in there from the start. The creature's deep, guttural breath passed through the crack, spreading that stench of death across my face. He didn't make any aggressive sounds. His mere presence, watching his trapped prey, was a declaration of intent. I was trapped, and he had just found me. Having those malevolent yellow eyes fixed on me through the crack in the wood shattered any sense of security I might still have had. To understand the magnitude of my despair at that moment, it's crucial to understand exactly where this abandoned structure was located. The barn sat on the edge of an old bankrupt logging estate, about 40 miles from the nearest town, a small logging village nestled in the foothills of the Cascade Mountains. This wasn't a brightly lit family campground or a park with paved trails. We're talking thousands of acres of the densest, darkest, most impenetrable forest you can imagine. The trees there, mostly enormous pines, easily reach over 100 feet in height, blocking out the sunlight even at midday, creating a perpetual twilight at ground level. The town I'd left hours earlier consisted mainly of a dilapidated gas station, a diner, and residents who rarely smiled at outsiders. I vaguely remember an old man at the diner giving me a strange look when I mentioned which route I would take for my hike. He just muttered something about the old dirt roads being godforsaken territory. I, being the typical Seattle resident accustomed to urban comforts, ignored the veiled warning. To me, it was just trees and rocks. But now, trapped in that rotting, waterlogged space, I realized how much wild and isolated nature can hide horrors that modern civilization has chosen to forget. The geographical isolation weighed on me like a 1,000-pound anchor. There would be no highway patrol passing by. No one would come looking for me before Monday. I was absolutely and completely on my own, isolated from the rest of the world by an ocean of trees and mud. Trying to control the uncontrollable trembling of my hands, my mind began to piece together what had happened earlier that day. The original intention was to complete a 15-mile hike, something that would require effort but would provide me with the peace away from the city that I so desperately sought. However, from the moment I parked my car and entered the start of the trail, an inexplicable feeling of inadequacy took hold of me. The forest was terribly silent, the birds weren't singing, and there was no characteristic noise of small rodents moving among the dry leaves. About 5 miles into my route, I found something that should have made me turn back immediately. It was the carcass of an adult deer, but it wasn't just slaughtered. It had been completely torn apart, and parts of the bone structure seemed to have been crushed by an absurd force far superior to the capacity of any common predator. Furthermore, the remains were hanging from the branches of a tree, at least 12 feet off the ground. At the time, my rational mind tried to justify the bizarre scene by blaming an improbable attack by a large feline, even though the height was absurd. The most frightening thing, reflecting now, was the feeling of being watched for all the subsequent hours. On several occasions, I felt the hairs on my arms stand on end, and the thermometer in my backpack indicated a sharp drop in temperature, falling to around 40 degrees Fahrenheit with no clouds in the sky to justify the cold. I saw thick shadows moving out of the corner of my eye between the thick tree trunks, but when I turned to look directly at them, there was nothing there. It had been following me since the afternoon, studying my movements, waiting for the moment when I was vulnerable. Direct eye contact through the crack in the barn wall lasted only a few seconds before a new lightning bolt illuminated the sky, but it was enough to scar my soul. After that icy stare, the creature retreated slightly, disappearing into the heavy curtain of rain, but I knew it hadn't gone away. The interior of the barn, which had previously seemed a safe haven from the storm, now revealed itself as a perfect trap, a dark wooden box from which I had no escape. The temperature continued to drop rapidly. The air must have been near 32 degrees Fahrenheit now, as the dampness of my cold sweat began to chill my skin, and my breath formed dense white clouds of vapor in the darkness. Despite the intense cold, what dominated the atmosphere was the repulsive smell it had brought with it. The odor of wet fur mixed with a thick, rotten smell of carrion was ingrained in the wooden planks, penetrating my throat with every breath and causing intense nausea. To try and see better without revealing my exact position, I kept my flashlight off. The barn roof, which must have been over 30 feet high at its highest point, was full of holes, letting the rain seep in and forming dark puddles on the dirt floor and rotting straw. The shadows cast by the old, rusty machinery took on demonic shapes every time the sky flashed with lightning. That gigantic space, which had previously seemed empty, now felt claustrophobic. Every wooden beam creaked in the wind, and amidst this climatic chaos, my hearing was heightened to its limit, focused solely on trying to pick up any noise coming from outside the barn. The storm raged with relentless ferocity, but somehow the sound of the creature's heavy movements outside managed to stand out from the fury of the wind. It began to circle the structure, walking slowly on 2 legs. With each step, the soaked mud and gravel floor gave way beneath what must have been a massive weight, over 400 pounds of pure muscle. There was no hurry in its walk. It was a calculated and deliberate gait of a hunter who knows its prey has nowhere to run. I heard the sound of its immense claws lightly scratching the exterior wood, testing the walls. The sound of rough friction against the rotten boards rose from the foundations, almost to roof level, giving me a terrifying sense of the absurd reach of its arms. It wasn't just tall. It possessed a monstrous anatomy, a grotesque mixture of human agility and savage brutality. As it circled the barn, my brain worked desperately searching for escape options, but all logical exits died instantly. The main door I entered through was very heavy and would make a terrible noise if I tried to open it. The high window was completely out of reach, and even if I managed to climb up there, he would probably be waiting for me on the other side. Panic rose in my throat like acid. I felt my heart pounding against my ribs so hard I thought he could hear it. He was toying with me, using fear as a tool to weaken me before the inevitable. The psychological horror of being hunted reached a new level when the footsteps around the building stopped abruptly. The silence that followed between gusts of wind was torturous. I stood paralyzed in my hiding place behind the hay bales, gripping the handle of my flashlight so tightly that my knuckles ached. Then the side wall of the barn, about 20 feet from where I was huddled, gave way slightly inward with a dull, powerful thud. He had thrown himself against the structure. The wood creaked dangerously, and a lot of dust and cobwebs fell from the ceiling onto me. He wasn't trying to break in all at once. He was testing the barn's integrity, looking for the weakest point. A second impact followed, this time a little closer to the double doors. The floor vibrated beneath my feet. The disproportionate force of the blow caused the metal bar I had improvised as a lock on the main doors to groan under the pressure. It was clear that the old wood wouldn't withstand the creature's weight and aggression for much longer. He was aware of the fragility of my shelter. The malevolent intelligence in his movements was what terrified me most. Normal animals, in the midst of a storm of that magnitude, would be seeking refuge and trying to preserve their body heat. But he was actively expending energy to corner me. I felt a drop of icy sweat trickle down my temple. The game of cat and mouse was coming to an end, and he was about to decide that the game had lasted long enough. The confrontation was imminent, and with my legs trembling and the cold freezing my muscles, I wasn't sure if I would even be able to stand when he finally entered. That brief moment of silence after the impact against the wall was far worse than the noise of the storm. I crouched in the dark, holding my breath, while the 30-something degree Fahrenheit cold seeped through the cracks in the structure, freezing the sweat on my skin. I expected a brutal attack, an irrational charge from an enraged animal trying to knock down the rotting wood with its head. However, what followed proved that I was dealing with a creature of disturbing intelligence. The heavy footsteps resumed, but this time there was no hurry. It walked around the perimeter with the patience of a calculating hunter, testing each loose board, pushing the old tools leaning against the wall to see if they revealed any secret entrances. The friction of its thick claws against the outer wood echoed through the cavernous space of the barn, creating a continuous scraping noise that made every hair on my body stand on end. The creature was literally feeling its way around the structure, searching for the exact point where it would give way with the slightest effort. This terrified me viscerally, because it showed that he wasn't acting on pure predatory instinct. He was planning the invasion. With each lap he completed around the barn, the nauseating stench of rotting meat and muddy fur permeated the air more intensely, signaling his physical proximity. The isolation suffocated me, and the certainty that no one within a 50-mile radius could hear my cries for help transformed that space into my premature tomb. With the absolute certainty that the invasion was only a matter of time, the paralysis of fear had to give way to a primal instinct for survival. I wouldn't die huddled in the dark without a fight. Keeping my body as close to the damp earth floor as possible, I began to crawl silently through the interior of the barn, guiding myself only by the intermittent flashes of lightning. The space was a labyrinth of old farm equipment and moldy hay bales. My waterproof jacket rubbed against rusty tractor parts, and I hoped the sound of the wind would drown out any noise I made. About 15 feet from where I had originally been hiding, I found an old workbench, covered in thick dust and cobwebs. I groped across the surface in the dark, accidentally cutting my palm on a rusty nail, until my fingers found something solid. It was a heavy pipe wrench, made entirely of solid iron, easily weighing about 10 pounds. The metal was incredibly cold, but holding it gave me a false sense of security. I knew that an impact tool would do little against a creature weighing over 400 pounds with claws the size of hunting knives, but it was all I had. I whispered to myself in an almost inaudible murmur that I needed to stay calm and aim for the head if it managed to get in. I positioned myself behind the gigantic wheel of an old tractor, using the machinery as a physical barrier between myself and the main double doors, while my eyes scanned the absolute darkness ahead, waiting for the fatal move. The tension in the air shifted abruptly when the heavy footsteps on the muddy ground stopped again. The silence that followed didn't last long. A few seconds later, the entire barn structure groaned under a colossal weight that suddenly surged over the side wall. It was climbing, the sound of immense claws piercing the wooden planks and the thud of muscles tearing through the cold wind made it clear what was happening. In a matter of moments, the heavy sound shifted toward me. It had reached the roof, which was over 35 feet high. The impact of its footsteps on the zinc roof and rotting wood sent dust, dry splinters, and bat droppings raining down on my face. The structure swayed and creaked sharply under the creature's footsteps. I looked up, completely mesmerized by terror, watching the wood buckle with each step of that monster. The roof seemed poised to collapse at any moment, and the thought of that abomination falling directly on me in the dark left me breathless. It paced back and forth up there, its slow, calculated steps demonstrating an absurd level of balance for something of that size. The monster stopped exactly at the center, directly above where I was hiding, as if it could smell my fear or hear the erratic beating of my heart through the ceiling. It knew exactly where in the barn I was sheltered. The creature didn't stay on the roof for long. Its excessive weight likely demonstrated that the structure above wouldn't withstand a forced opening without collapsing completely. With a sharp movement that made the ground tremble, it leaped from a height of 20 feet directly into the mud outside, landing heavily yet nimbly. Its quick steps aggressively circled the barn until it stopped right in front of the main entrance. The heavy double doors, which I had tried to lock by improvising with a loose wooden beam, were the last significant obstacle. The air seemed to grow even colder, the temperature nearing an unbearable level as the thick metal doorknob on the outside was violently turned. The makeshift lock creaked under the brutal pressure. The creature began to force the center of the doors, pushing with tremendous force. The gap between the two wooden leaves began to widen slowly, and it was then that I saw through the newly opened space a vision that will haunt my nightmares forever. A dark hand, covered in coarse fur stained with dried blood, slid inside. The fingers were absurdly long, ending in sharp claws, thick and long like industrial hooks, measuring at least 5 inches of pure darkened bone. The paw gripped the edge of the wooden door so tightly that the fibers began to break and splinter. It was pulling the door toward it, fighting against the locking mechanism with a force that would soon cause the metal to give way. Blind panic overwhelmed my logical reasoning. Seeing that immense claw gripping the wood, just 20 feet from my hiding place, materialized all the abstract horror of the night into a lethal physical danger. The storm outside reached its peak of ferocity, the rain lashing the roof and the winds howling through the cracks, but the only thing that existed for me was the imminence of the invasion. The creature's scent was now completely inside the barn, the slaughterhouse odor making the air thick and difficult to breathe. The metal bar I was holding seemed increasingly useless against something capable of splintering thick wood with just a squeeze. The creature outside breathed heavily and gutturally, the air it expelled creating dense vapor that seeped in through the crack in the door. It pushed even harder, and the sound of my retaining beam buckling reached an unbearable pitch. The rusted screws of the hinges began to fly from the wall, falling to the earthen floor with dry, metallic echoes. The monster was deliberately tearing its way inside, destroying the only shield that separated me from violent death in the middle of nowhere. I gathered all the strength that remained in my frozen body, gripped my makeshift weapon, and prepared for the moment when the wood would finally shatter into pieces. The wood could no longer withstand the strain. The thick beam I had placed as a lock gave way, splitting in two with a violent crash that echoed through the barn like a cannon shot. The sound of the thick structure breaking apart filled the chaotic space. The upper hinges were brutally ripped from the wall, and the heavy right door tumbled onto the dirt floor. The abrupt opening allowed the storm to invade the interior with full force. Relentless gusts of wind, with the temperature plummeting rapidly to near 30 degrees Fahrenheit, swept through the space, scattering rotten straw, dust, and debris everywhere. But the cold wasn't what kept me frozen in place. There, completely filling the destroyed doorframe, was it. The creature stepped forward, entering the barn completely, and the intense light of a lightning bolt allowed me to see its colossal silhouette clearly for the first time. He should easily have been 8 feet tall if he stood fully upright, but he walked with a slightly hunched posture, his broad, absurdly monstrous shoulders almost touching the top of the doorframe. This sight shattered everything I knew about biology. His body was covered in thick, very dark and completely soaked fur, clinging to muscles that looked ready to burst beneath the skin. Every minimal movement of his demonstrated a lethal physical power that the human mind simply cannot process at such close range. Rain streamed down his elongated snout, and the repugnant smell of death, clotted blood, and slaughterhouse filled the barn so intensely and concentratedly that my eyes began to burn and tear uncontrollably. The terrible reality crushed me. I was trapped with no way out, sharing the same environment as the absolute predator of the forests. The monster stopped just after crossing the entrance, water running down its colossal body and forming a dark mud puddle at its massive feet. The next flash of lightning revealed the anatomical details that still wake me up in the middle of the night trembling. Its legs were disturbingly structured, the joints bending backward like the hind paws of a wild canid, but thick as old tree trunks, supporting a weight that certainly easily surpassed 500 pounds of pure strength. Its chest and arms were almost humanoid in proportion, incredibly wide and defined, but ending in those paws with absurdly long claws, the same ones I had seen tearing through the wooden door moments before. The head, however, was the worst and most terrifying part of its entire form. It was the immense head of a monstrous wolf, but its features carried a demonic, distorted, and almost sadistic expression. Its upper lip was slightly retracted, exposing sharp, yellowish fangs the size of hunting knives. And its eyes, those large yellow orbs, gleamed in the darkness, scanning the surroundings with perverse precision. It wasn't sniffing the air for its prey. It knew my exact location from the moment it stepped into the room. Its immense head slowly turned, locking its gaze directly on me, focusing on the narrow space between the tractor's gigantic wheel and the wall where I huddled. The air seemed to lose all oxygen. The silence that settled between the thunderclaps outside was torturous. I gripped the heavy metal wrench with both hands, but my arms were completely numb with paralyzing terror. The creature tilted its head to the side, a calculating gesture that indicated a deadly curiosity. It was relishing the hunt. The distance separating us was only 20 feet. Each passing second seemed to stretch time into an agonizing eternity. The monster began to walk toward me. It didn't run, it didn't jump, it simply began a heavy, deliberate, and extremely slow march. With each step it took, the earthen floor vibrated perceptibly, and the sound of its thick claws scraping against the damp stones sent waves of deep dread down my spine. Its breathing was loud, guttural, and steady, filling the entire emptiness of the old barn. It passed the old farm tools without even touching them, demonstrating an impressive spatial awareness in that near-total darkness. The distance decreased to 15 feet, then to just 10. I was completely trapped, my back pressed painfully against the cold, rough wood of the wall, and the heavy iron machinery blocking any lateral escape. The air temperature near it seemed even lower than near the open door, as if the creature itself radiated an aura of pure cold and despair. I desperately tried to stand up using the side of the tractor wheel as a foothold, but my legs simply refused to obey my brain's commands. Instinct screamed for me to run, but the trap was closed. He stopped just a few feet from the rusty metal barrier that pathetically protected me. The gigantic shadow he cast swallowed me whole. That fetid smell was ingrained in my clothes. I looked up with difficulty and saw the imposing figure leaning gently over the machine. His broad snout was less than 3 feet from my terrified face, watching my downfall. Desperation reached a level that eliminated any mental block, causing my body to act automatically. When the creature's immense arm rose and its clawed hand descended toward me, I closed my eyes in pure instinct and threw the massive iron key with all the violent force remaining in my muscles, aiming for the center of the aberration's skull. The blow was swift and driven by panic. The heavy metal found its target squarely, striking the rigid side of its snout and part of its lower jaw. The creature's physical response was devastating to any shred of hope I had. The impact of the tool, which weighed at least 10 pounds and would have been enough to knock down any human aggressor, seemed only to irritate it. The iron key ricocheted off the hard bone, slipping from my weak hands and falling far away into the darkness. The monster recoiled slightly, releasing an extremely low and aggressive vibration from the depths of its throat, something that made my teeth chatter. Before I could even think of retreating or protecting myself, its massive paw lunged at me. The incredibly sharp claws didn't pierce me directly, but its thick hand gripped the heavy collar of my waterproof jacket and the fabric of my shirt in one swift motion. I was violently lifted off the ground as if my body weighed nothing. My boots hung in the empty air as I was pulled forward, face to face with the beast's full fury. Bloody fangs were mere inches from my vulnerable neck. The creature's arm strength was inexplicable, holding my 180 pounds suspended in the air with just one paw. I stared into those deadly yellow eyes, knowing my end would be in the bowels of that cursed forest. At that moment, when the world seemed to stop and ultimate darkness was about to take over, the violent storm outside reached its destructive peak. A lightning bolt of terrifying proportions ripped through the sky, striking with devastating precision a huge, centuries-old pine tree located just a few feet from the barn. The sound was immediate and deafening, exceeding the limits of ear pain, followed almost instantly by the apocalyptic impact of the immense tree collapsing onto the already fragile roof structure. The old, waterlogged wood immediately gave way under thousands of pounds of massive trunk and thick branches. Huge support beams and several zinc sheets crumbled onto the opposite side of the barn, raising a thick, suffocating cloud of dust. The abrupt surprise and physical shock of the violent impact that shook the entire earth startled the creature for a fraction of a second. The monster shifted its penetrating gaze to the collapsing roof, instinctively loosening its steel grip on my clothes. Without thinking, I seized that millisecond of hesitation. I contorted my body with absurd violence, deliberately slipping out of the jacket he was gripping tightly, and plummeted onto the gravel ground in an awkward, painful mound. The direct impact knocked all the oxygen from my lungs, but the adrenaline suppressed the pain of the fall. Without wasting a moment to look back, I crawled across the dirt and nail-strewn ground, quickly rolling under another heavy farm machine. The fallen tree had completely destroyed the back wall of the barn, creating a jagged, dark hole that led directly into the rain-ravaged forest. The chaos of the collapse and the wind muffled my movements, creating a desperate and impossible escape route, the only window of opportunity before that nightmare realized I had fled. The chaos created by the collapse of the centuries-old tree onto the decaying structure of the barn was the only tiny distraction that could save my life on that dark night. dragging myself feverishly beneath the rusty farm machinery, my lungs burning from lack of oxygen and my muscles completely numb from the biting cold. I squeezed through the dense cloud of dust and wood debris. The temperature had plummeted to nearly 28 degrees Fahrenheit, and the icy rain pouring in through the new opening in the roof lashed my face mercilessly. Looking back was not a viable option. The primal instinct for self-preservation took complete control of every nerve ending in my body, dictating that I needed to cover the 40 feet separating me from the enormous jagged hole in the back wall as quickly as possible. The ground was covered in sharp splinters, rusted nails and puddles of dark mud that made it difficult for my heavy boots to grip, but the adrenaline suppressed any pain from the superficial cuts I was accumulating. The darkness was almost total, broken only by the sporadic and violent flashes of lightning in the tumultuous sky, momentarily illuminating the crack in the wooden structure through which I needed to pass. As I approached the makeshift exit, I could feel the brute force of the storm pulling me outside. The hole forced by the thick branches of the fallen pine was about 6 feet in diameter, enough for me to throw myself headfirst into the mud outside. The wind howled through the crack, but beneath this deafening climatic sound, my terrified mind swore it could hear the monstrous creature recovering from its initial surprise and beginning to search for the prey that had just escaped its immense claws. The jacket I left behind wouldn't delay it by more than a few seconds. I was now completely exposed to the elements, wearing only a soaked flannel shirt clinging to my body, facing the horror of the dense forest that stretched endlessly into the night. As soon as my body collided with the cold, thick mud outside, I didn't waste a single fraction of a second trying to get myself to my feet properly. I began to crawl awkwardly for about 30 feet until I found the initial cover of the nearest trees, propelling my legs with a desperate force I didn't know I possessed. The forest there was a colossal, impenetrable barrier of dark trunks and thorny undergrowth, a natural labyrinth designed to disorient any human being. I began a frantic blind run through the dense bushes, repeatedly stumbling over thick roots that jutted out of the damp ground like skeletal arms trying to hold me back. I mentally calculated that I would need to cover at least 3 miles on that rugged, slippery terrain before I had any chance of reaching the nearest paved highway, if I was following the correct direction on the invisible compass of my terrified mind. During the first mile, the feeling of being actively hunted weighed unbearably on my shoulders. With each stumble, each time my face collided with low branches that left bloody marks on my skin, I felt the menacing presence of that monstrous abomination right behind me. The creature of absurd proportions, weighing hundreds of pounds, possessed a silent agility that defied all the natural laws of physics, moving through the shadows without revealing its exact location. The nauseating smell of slaughterhouse and dirty fur seemed to travel on the icy wind, suggesting that the monster was toying with me, allowing me to tire myself to the brink of exhaustion before delivering the final blow. The sub-zero temperature continued to drain the vital heat from my body, and my vision began to blur from the constant raindrops and the extreme cardiovascular exertion. There was nowhere to run but to keep moving relentlessly through the slippery mud, silently praying that my legs wouldn't give out before I found any trace of modern civilization or some source of artificial light to guide me out of that endless nightmare. The desperate race through the unforgiving vegetation took its physical toll after about 2 miles of continuous, brutal effort. My lungs burned intensely with each forced breath, and the muscles in my thighs and calves threatened complete collapse. The forest seemed to close in even further around me, making movement almost impossible. However, just when giving up seemed like the only alternative to the excruciating pain, a subtle change in the terrain caught my attention. The muddy, uneven ground began to give way to firmer gravel, and the slope of the soil indicated a man-made embankment. I forced my body through the last dense barrier of thorny bushes, tearing the fabric of my shirt and the skin of my arms, and fell heavily onto the hard, wet surface of an asphalt road. I had reached the secondary highway that cut through the mountainous region. The relief was instant, but the vulnerability of lying on the exposed asphalt in the middle of a severe storm with the dark forest behind me brought a new wave of panic. I lay face down for a moment, the icy water washing the dirt from my face, while my eyes scanned the absolute darkness in both directions of the road. The silence of the empty road was crushing. I was miles from any inhabited town, and the chance of a vehicle passing by in those extreme weather conditions was close to zero. I mustered my last reserves of strength to drag myself to the center of the road, refusing to stay near the tree line, where I knew the predator's yellow, malevolent eyes might be watching me from the darkness. After long, agonizing minutes of waiting in the paralyzing cold, a faint light began to form on the distant bend, gradually growing until it revealed the bright, blinding headlights of a logging truck tearing through the storm. The driver of the heavy vehicle braked sharply when he saw me staggering in the middle of the road, the gigantic wheels locking up and sliding slightly on the soaked asphalt, stopping less than 15 feet from where I stood, completely paralyzed and in a state of deep shock. The heavy door of the truck cab swung open, and the worried figure of the driver emerged, shouting orders that my traumatized ears could barely process due to the persistent ringing and thermal shock. Unable to explain anything at all, I was pulled into the heated cab, where the comforting temperature of 72 degrees Fahrenheit violently crashed against my frozen skin, causing uncontrollable shivers throughout my exhausted body. The driver, an experienced local man, didn't demand immediate explanations upon seeing my deplorable state, covered in dried blood, thick mud, and with an expression of utter terror etched on my face. He immediately threw a thermal blanket over my trembling shoulders and engaged the heavy gear, accelerating the immense vehicle away from that cursed forest as fast as the road conditions allowed. As the miles receded, swallowed by the darkness of the rearview mirror, I remained completely silent, fixing my blank gaze on the illuminated dashboard of the truck. The human mind possesses peculiar defense mechanisms, and mine was working at breakneck speed to try and process or deny the magnitude of what I had just experienced. The most evident physical scar was the excruciating pain in my shoulders and extreme muscle exhaustion, but the psychological damage was infinitely deeper and more permanent. I knew with a terrible and irrefutable certainty that the monster of perverse intelligence, the bipedal figure with immense claws and a monstrous snout, was not a myth fabricated to frighten people around campfires. The creature existed, hunted, and possessed a brutality that the civilized world safe in its urban centers would never be able to comprehend or accept. The safety of the Seattle city lights, which eventually materialized on the horizon after hours of a silent journey, could not erase the image of those yellow, predatory eyes that still burned vividly in the darkest part of my fragmented memory, ensuring that I would never feel truly safe again. The months that followed that catastrophic night in the Cascade Mountains irreversibly and definitively transformed my perception of reality. My city routine resumed, but the superficiality of urban life and the false sense of control became evident to me. I sold all my hiking equipment, cancelled future camping plans, and vowed to myself never again to stray from brightly lit, populated areas where concrete and steel offer an illusion of safety. The entity I faced in that abandoned barn was not a simple predator seeking food. It was the embodiment of an archaic horror, a malevolent force of nature operating under its own sadistic rules. When darkness falls on the city and the cold wind howls through the closed windows of my well-heated apartment, the uncontrollable tremors return, bringing with them the ghostly smell of soaked fur and rotting flesh. The forest holds perverse secrets, colossal aberrations that walk on two legs in the thick shadows, observing the steps of the unwary with a sharp and destructive intellect. Isolation in the midst of nature is not a search for peace, but an invasion of a territory where humankind occupies the absolute base of the food chain. This account does not seek to convince skeptics, but serves as a visceral warning to those who believe they are alone and protected when venturing along remote trails forgotten by the authorities. The darkness hides entities that should not exist, ready to exact the price for our arrogance. If you survived this terrifying journey and want to continue exploring the darker side of fear, be sure to support the channel. Like the video, leave a comment telling us which part of the story gave you the most chills, and share it with that friend who swears they're not afraid of anything. Subscribe to Mr. Nightmare Scares You now. Turn on notifications so you don't miss any of our scary legends and true stories, and always remember to keep the doors locked. Until our next encounter in the shadows.